It was a quiet Thursday morning in Brussels when George Whitaker's life turned upside down. At 52, with over 2 decades of experience in commercial property negotiation, George had seen his fair share of challenges. Business deals that almost fell through, contracts filled with hidden traps, and moments where precision was the only thing standing between success and failure. But nothing could have prepared him for the phone call that would unravel his entire world. On the other end of the line, his wife, Vanessa, sounded almost casual. "I'm divorcing you," she said, her voice strangely calm. "And I've already sold the beach house. Kyle and I need a fresh start." Her words hit George like a freight train, but instead of reacting in anger or desperation, he stayed eerily composed, responding with only a single, steady question. "When did you close the sale?" The house, the one they had poured their hearts into, a sanctuary by the ocean, was gone. In the blink of an eye, his years of hard work, the very place where their lives had been built together, had been sold without his knowledge. And now, the woman he'd spent 15 years with was walking away with another man. As the rain began to fall softly outside his hotel window, George's mind raced. But it wasn't with rage. It wasn't even with sadness. It was with a quiet, unshakable resolve. Because George Whitaker wasn't just a man of business. He was a man of precision. And this moment of betrayal was no different from a bad deal gone wrong. It was a challenge to be solved. So, what happens when a man who has spent decades protecting assets and making deals has to protect his heart? Stay with me as I take you through the journey of George Whitaker, the man who, despite being blindsided by the woman he trusted, used his skills and his unshakable calm to reclaim what was rightfully his, and find out just how far the price of betrayal really goes. This isn't just a story of a failed marriage. It's a story about taking back control, finding justice in the most unlikely of places, and realizing that sometimes the end of something isn't the end at all. It's the beginning of something much bigger. So grab your coffee, sit back, and let me tell you how George Whitaker took on a battle that no one saw coming. It was a Thursday morning in Brussels when George Whitaker's life took a turn he never saw coming. George, 52, a seasoned property negotiator with years of experience in handling high-stakes deals, had learned to navigate chaos with precision. But no amount of experience could prepare him for the calm, yet devastating phone call he received that day. "I'm divorcing you," Vanessa, his wife of 15 years, told him. Her voice, despite the gravity of her words, sounded almost casual. "And I've already sold the beach house. Kyle and I need a fresh start." There was a brief pause. George's heart sank, and his mind raced to understand the weight of what she had just said. Yet, despite the shock, he didn't shout, didn't slam his fist against the desk in anger. Instead, with a calmness that surprised even him, he asked, "When did you close the sale?" This wasn't a scene of wild accusations or frantic emotions. It was the beginning of something entirely different, an end marked by precision and composure. Now, you might wonder, how did George manage to stay so composed? How could he respond with such calmness in the face of such a personal betrayal? The answer lies not just in his professional background, but in something deeper, the power of observing life without rushing to react. George has spent years in his career scrutinizing contracts, reading every word carefully, and identifying the details others overlooked. In this moment, those same skills, his ability to remain steady under pressure and his patience, became his greatest strength. Perhaps like George, you've had moments in life when everything seemed to shift unexpectedly, yet instead of reacting hastily, you chose to pause and think it through. That pause, that decision to stay calm in the face of chaos, is often the first step toward clarity and control. George's story is about more than just betrayal. It's about how our reactions in moments of crisis shape not only our lives, but also our futures. And as we move forward with this story, think about this. What would you do if faced with a similar situation? How would you handle such a betrayal? And what would it take to protect what's truly important to you? Stay with me as we uncover how George used his calm, calculated approach to turn the tables in a way no one expected. George Whitaker was a man of precision. His career as a commercial property negotiator had spanned over 2 decades, during which time he had built a reputation for spotting opportunities others often overlooked. While most people focus on the obvious, George had an eye for the finer details, The fine print in contracts, the small clauses that could make or break a deal, and the underlying value in properties that seemed less than promising at first glance. It was this meticulous attention to detail that had made him so successful in his field. He had a gift for seeing what others didn't, a knack for making connections between seemingly unrelated factors, and an unwavering ability to stay calm in the midst of high-pressure negotiations. These were the qualities that had propelled him to the top of his profession, securing lucrative deals and earning the respect of colleagues and clients alike. Whether he was finalizing a warehouse acquisition in Brussels or scouting properties in other parts of the world, George's work was always marked by one thing: precision. But despite all his success in business, when it came to his personal life, George couldn't help but fall into a different pattern. The sharp attention to detail that served him so well in his career seemed to vanish when it came to his marriage. In his professional life, George would never have signed a contract without thoroughly reviewing every clause, every line. Yet, when it came to his relationship with Vanessa, the details were easy to overlook. The small changes in her behavior, the sudden distance, and the late nights at the gym with Kyle, all of these signs had slipped by him unnoticed, just like a hidden clause buried deep in a contract. This stark contrast between George's professional life and his personal life is something many of us can relate to. In business, we are often sharp, calculated, and thoughtful about every decision. But when it comes to the people we love, we tend to trust too easily, letting small details slip through the cracks. George's story is a reminder that while it's important to pay attention to the fine print in business, it's equally important to notice the small shifts in our relationships before they spiral out of control. His failure to notice the signs in his marriage didn't make him any less successful in his career, but it did show how easy it is to neglect the ones closest to us, even when we're experts at observing everything else. As we move forward, let's think about this. How many times do we overlook the small, subtle signs in our personal lives that could be just as important as the details in a business contract? How often do we take for granted the people who matter most, thinking they will always be there, only to realize later that we've missed the warning signs? George's experience serves as a wake-up call to anyone who might be neglecting the finer details of their personal relationships. After all, sometimes it's those details that can change everything. In the early years of their marriage, George and Vanessa had been the perfect couple. They shared dreams, traveled together, and built a life full of love and mutual respect. Vanessa, once an energetic, loving wife, seemed like the ideal partner. She was supportive, dedicated, and always by George's side, whether a real estate conference or spending quiet weekends at their beach house. It was easy for George to believe that their marriage was solid. After all, they had worked hard together, and she had always been there, laughing, planning, and supporting him. But over time, something began to shift. Vanessa, once warm and loving, became more distant. At first, George attributed her changes to the demands of her interior design business. After all, she'd started her own company, juggling work, travel, and a growing social calendar. Yet, as the months passed, her behavior grew even more peculiar. She started spending more time at the gym, often staying there for hours, training with Kyle, her personal trainer, and her texts to George became shorter, more robotic. Have a good meeting, safe travels. Gone were the I miss you messages or the excitement she once had when George returned home. Instead of engaging in meaningful conversation, Vanessa would often brush him off with vague responses or an indifference that felt foreign to their once vibrant relationship. But George didn't act immediately. He didn't question her strange behavior. Instead, he quietly observed, unsure whether to confront her or let things unfold on their own. Perhaps, like so many people in relationships, he believed things would get better with time. Perhaps he didn't want to face the reality that their bond might be breaking down. This, however, was where George made the first in a series of critical mistakes. Many people in relationships overlook subtle changes, assuming that this too shall pass. They avoid asking uncomfortable questions or confronting potential issues for fear of disturbing the peace. But in relationships, silence can be just as dangerous as confrontation. It allows problems to fester and grow until they're no longer ignorable. Vanessa's increasing distance was a warning sign, a sign that George, in his blind trust, didn't see clearly at first. How often do we, In our own relationships, let the small changes go unaddressed. How often do we allow doubts to linger without openly discussing them with our partners? This is a mistake many of us make. We fear rocking the boat, but in doing so, we risk watching the boat slowly sink. Vanessa's growing isolation wasn't just about her fitness routine or her business. It was about something deeper, something that George would only realize later. She was emotionally distancing herself, and rather than confronting her, George continued to assume that everything was fine. This behavior was not just a betrayal of their relationship, but a reflection of a much larger issue, a lack of communication. When one person stops sharing their thoughts, feelings, and concerns with their partner, the foundation of the relationship begins to crack. This part of the story serves as a reminder for all of us. Don't let the small signs go unnoticed. If something feels off, ask the difficult questions. Don't be afraid to address issues head-on, even if it's uncomfortable. Ignoring the small cracks in a relationship doesn't make them go away. It only makes them worse. As the distance between George and Vanessa continued to grow, so did the cracks in their marriage. Vanessa, now fully invested in her new life with Kyle, began to make decisions that George never could have anticipated. The first sign that something was seriously wrong came when George was halfway across the world in Brussels, finalizing a major business deal. It was then that Vanessa made a move that would shake their world. She attempted to sell their beach house, the very place where they had created so many memories. The sale was swift and seemingly smooth. Vanessa had managed to find a buyer for their beach house, a beautiful property they had bought together years ago. But there was one glaring problem. George had not been consulted. The sale had taken place without his knowledge or consent, and it wasn't just any regular sale. The buyer was vague, and the terms were far from transparent. It was clear something was off. But what Vanessa didn't know was that George had been watching closely, even if from a distance. Over the years, George had always been cautious when it came to money and assets. He knew that in both business and personal life, things could change in an instant. With his instincts on high alert, he had taken the necessary steps to ensure that the beach house would be protected, no matter what happened in their marriage. Several months before the attempt to sell, George had transferred the ownership of the property into a living trust. This was a strategy that had served him well in his professional life, and it was a move he had decided to apply to his personal life. The property was no longer solely in his and Vanessa's names. It was held in a trust with George as the sole trustee. Why did George take this step? It was simple. He knew that life was unpredictable. He had spent years negotiating high-stakes deals and had seen firsthand how easily things could go wrong when no one was looking. Trusts like the one George set up were common in property deals, offering protection for assets in case of unforeseen circumstances. He knew that protecting his investments meant preparing for the unexpected, including the possibility of a messy divorce or betrayal. This decision, while seemingly small at the time, would prove to be the safety net George needed when Vanessa's actions threatened to take everything from him. The trust was a brilliant example of foresight, a move that many people fail to make until it's too late. In this case, George's careful planning and financial strategy allowed him to maintain control of his most valuable asset, despite his wife's attempt to sell it without his consent. When George first received a call from Vanessa about the sale of the beach house, his mind immediately started racing. His wife, the woman he had spent 15 years with, had just informed him in a calm tone that she had sold their home without his consent. Many people in George's position would have acted out of anger or frustration. The natural instinct would be to shout, to storm into the confrontation, and demand answers. But George didn't do that. Instead, he took a deep breath and remained composed, choosing to think carefully before reacting. Why? Because George knew that acting in haste could cloud his judgment and lead to decisions he might later regret. Instead of reacting emotionally, he chose to approach the situation with patience, using his professional skills as a negotiator to carefully consider his next move. Rather than rushing to call Vanessa or confront her immediately, George spent the next hour in his hotel room, thinking about his options. He understood the gravity of the situation, but he also knew that responding with calm precision would give him the upper hand. He decided to contact his attorney and title agent, the very people who had helped him set up the living trust in the first place, and made sure the fraudulent sale could be blocked. He wasn't going to let this chaotic situation overwhelm him. George's measured response was in stark contrast to how many people might react in a similar situation. In real life, when faced with betrayal or shock, many of us tend to let emotions take the wheel. We've all seen it. People screaming, throwing accusations, or even making rash decisions that only escalate the conflict. It's human nature to want to fight back when we feel betrayed. But as we've seen in countless stories, acting in the heat of the moment often makes things worse. Decisions made in anger can cause long-term damage, both emotionally and legally. Take, for instance, the story of a well-known businessman who discovered his partner had embezzled funds. In his rage, he confronted the partner violently, making threats that ended up being used against him in a court of law. The situation spiraled into a much bigger mess than it needed to be, and he lost control of the situation entirely. George, on the other hand, took the opposite approach. He chose to keep his cool, analyzing the situation before acting. In doing so, he not only protected his property, but also positioned himself as someone who was in control of the narrative. His actions showed that sometimes the best way to deal with a crisis is to take a step back, gather your thoughts, and respond with calculated precision. Now, as we've seen, George's ability to stay calm in the face of betrayal is nothing short of remarkable. But here's where I want to hear from you. How do you feel about his response? Could you have kept your composure like George, or would you have reacted differently? Have you ever faced a situation where you had to stay calm under pressure? What would you do if you were in George's shoes? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Let's start a conversation about the power of staying steady in life's toughest moments. After receiving the shocking news from Vanessa, George knew he couldn't let the situation unfold without taking action. He had planned his response carefully, and now it was time to execute his strategy. George returned home earlier than expected, arriving in Amelia Island with no warning. The calm determination in his mind was unwavering. He wasn't going to allow Vanessa to continue with her deception any longer. As George drove up to the beach house, he saw a black Mercedes convertible parked in his usual spot. His stomach tightened. He didn't need to guess who was inside. Kyle, the man Vanessa had been spending so much time with, was clearly there. The scene felt surreal. The home he had shared with his wife, the place where they had made memories, now felt foreign to him. He knew that what awaited him inside would change everything. He walked into the house without hesitation, not bothering to knock. As he entered, he heard the sound of voices coming from the kitchen. Vanessa and Kyle were speaking casually, discussing something about renovations. The sight of them together, Vanessa casually leaning against the kitchen island, a glass of champagne in hand, and Kyle standing behind her with his arm wrapped around her waist, cut through George like a knife. He had always believed they were a team, but now everything had shifted. "George," Vanessa said, her voice faltering for just a second before she quickly recovered. "I didn't expect you back until Monday." "Clearly," George replied, his tone even, his eyes fixed on the couple. Kyle awkwardly removed his arm from Vanessa's waist, and George could see the nervous tension building in the room. This moment, this confrontation, was a moment when everything changed. Kyle, clearly uncomfortable, tried to offer a nervous laugh. "This is awkward," he said. "I should probably go." "No," George replied coldly, his gaze fixed on both of them. "I'd prefer if you stayed. This concerns you too." It was in this moment, with Vanessa's facade starting to crack, that George laid down the truth she could no longer avoid. He calmly placed the deed for the beach house on the counter, along with the trust documents, and said the words that would end the game. "The house isn't yours to sell, Vanessa. It hasn't been for almost a year." Vanessa's expression shifted from surprise to panic. She snatched the documents from George's hand, scanning them furiously. The shock in her face was evident. "This isn't possible," she whispered. "Oh, it's very possible," George replied. "It's legally binding." George's calm, calculated demeanor contrasted sharply with Vanessa's frantic confusion. Kyle, too, seemed lost and confused as the reality of the situation hit him. The sale Vanessa had arranged was invalid. The property was no longer hers to sell, and everything she had tried to build with Kyle was crumbling right in front of her eyes. This confrontation was not just about legal documents or property. It was about facing the consequences of betrayal. In relationships, when trust is broken, there is always a price to be paid. Sometimes this price is emotional. Sometimes it's legal. And sometimes it's both. Psychologists often speak about the concept of paying the price in relationships. This doesn't necessarily mean financial or material costs, but rather the emotional and psychological consequences that come with dishonest actions. In this case, Vanessa had assumed that she could deceive George without facing any repercussions. She thought she could sell their home and walk away with her lover, leaving George behind. But George's response showed that there are always consequences to actions, especially when trust is betrayed. Vanessa, in trying to manipulate the situation for her own gain, failed to see the long-term damage she was causing. By not being honest with George, she had set herself up for a far worse outcome than she ever expected. This confrontation, as difficult as it was, forced Vanessa to face the reality of her actions. In relationships, when we avoid facing the consequences of our behavior, the damage becomes even greater. George's calm, calculated confrontation served as a powerful reminder that honesty, integrity, and accountability are essential to maintaining any relationship. When those principles are broken, it's only a matter of time before the truth comes to light. And when it does, we must be ready to face the consequences. When George Whitaker first received the devastating phone call from Vanessa, it wasn't just a betrayal of trust. It was an attack on his financial security. However, George was not just a victim of his wife's deception. He had already taken the necessary precautions to protect his most valuable asset, their beach house. In the months leading up to the phone call, George, a seasoned property negotiator, had been quietly observing the cracks forming in his marriage. He knew that things could go wrong at any time, and he was no stranger to the importance of protecting his assets. While many would have thought George was overly cautious, his background in property deals taught him the hard truth. Life and relationships can be unpredictable, so he made a strategic move. Before things went too far, George transferred the ownership of their beach house into a living trust. The trust was structured in a way that gave him sole control over property, ensuring that no matter what happened, Vanessa couldn't simply walk away with it. The house, once a symbol of their shared future, was now legally protected under the terms of a trust, and George had ensured that the property could not be sold without his consent. This move was a masterstroke of foresight. While Vanessa was busy planning her future with Kyle, George was quietly securing his own. The living trust allowed George to maintain control over property while also providing legal safeguards against any future disputes. It was a financial and legal maneuver that many people overlook, but in George's case, it proved invaluable. George's strategic approach to asset protection serves as a powerful lesson. It's not about assuming the worst. It's about preparing for the unexpected. By being proactive and securing his property under a living trust, George ensured that he had control over his assets, even when his marriage fell apart. This lesson is crucial for anyone looking to protect their wealth and future. The best time to secure your assets is before the need arises. In relationships, financial safety nets are not just for what-ifs. They are practical tools for ensuring your security and peace of mind. After the confrontation in the kitchen, things were never the same between George and Vanessa. What started as a betrayal over their beach house had now become a battle for their lives and their futures. George had every right to escalate the situation. He could have pressed criminal charges against Vanessa for attempting to fraudulently sell their home. The legal avenues were clear, and the evidence was on his side. Vanessa's actions were, without question, a breach of trust and an attempt to steal from him. But George, despite the depth of the betrayal, chose not to go down that path. He could have pursued a legal battle that would have torn apart their already fragile relationship even more, but instead, he made a choice to pursue fairness and justice through a settlement. He could have easily sought to punish Vanessa, but he didn't. Instead, he focused on protecting his assets and finding a resolution that allowed both of them to move forward without the bitter consequences of a drawn-out, damaging legal war. In the end, Vanessa agreed to the terms of the settlement. She would return a portion of the funds she had transferred from their joint savings, relinquish all claims to the beach house, and forfeit any rights to the new business she had been planning with Kyle. George would waive any claim to her new business venture, and in exchange, he would not press charges for the fraudulent sale attempt. George's decision to settle wasn't about letting Vanessa off the hook. It was about choosing what was best for his own peace of mind. He understood that, while Vanessa's actions were unjust, holding on to bitterness and seeking revenge wouldn't bring him peace. In a world where anger and resentment can cloud our judgment, George's choice to let go was a powerful example of maturity, wisdom, and personal strength. The concept of justice in relationships isn't always as straightforward as punishing someone for their wrongdoings. Sometimes, justice can mean finding a fair resolution that allows everyone involved to move forward. George could have sought retribution through the legal system, but he chose instead to look at the bigger picture, his own emotional and mental well-being. In this case, the lesson is clear. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, and justice doesn't always mean revenge. It's about finding a way to protect yourself, to ensure that wrongdoers are held accountable, but also letting go of the anger that can weigh you down. George's decision to settle and not pursue criminal charges against Vanessa shows that justice doesn't always have to come with a heavy hand. He chose to let go of the hurt and focus on his future, rather than being consumed by the past. In doing so, he took control of his life, reclaiming not just his assets but his peace. Many people in George's position would have chosen to make Vanessa suffer for her betrayal. However, his ability to walk away from vengeance and toward a fair resolution is something that offers a valuable lesson for all of us. Holding on to anger or desire for retribution can cloud our judgment, whereas letting go, while still standing firm on our boundaries, allows us to grow and heal. 3 months had passed since George and Vanessa finalized their divorce settlement, and the dust had finally begun to settle. George had spent those months focusing on rebuilding, not just his financial life, but his personal life as well. He had already put the betrayal behind him, choosing to channel his energy into something productive, something that gave him a sense of control and renewal. The first thing George did was focus on his investments. He had always been a savvy negotiator, and even though the sale of the beach house had been thwarted, he knew that his financial future still held opportunities. He expanded his real estate portfolio, investing in several properties that offered long-term returns. With each new deal, George felt a sense of accomplishment that reminded him of the satisfaction he once got from his career. But now it was deeper. It wasn't just about making money anymore. It was about proving to himself that he could rebuild and succeed, no matter what happened in his personal life. But it wasn't just about the properties. George also focused on restoring the beach house, the place where so many of his memories with Vanessa had been made. The house had once symbolized their dreams, their future together. But now, it would symbolize something entirely different, a new chapter in his life. The repairs and renovations weren't just physical. They were deeply personal. Each brushstroke on the walls, each new floorboard he laid down, was a metaphor for his own healing process. George was taking control of his life once more, transforming the house into a place where he could move forward with strength and purpose. Divorce often feels like the end of the world for many. It's a painful, emotional process that leaves people feeling lost, unsure, and broken. But what George's story shows is that while divorce can be the end of one chapter, it is also the beginning of another, a chapter filled with new possibilities and new growth. George didn't let the pain of his past dictate his future. Instead, he used that pain as fuel for his growth, focusing on what he could control and what was still within his reach. In real-life stories, we often hear people who go through a similar transformation. Take, for example, the story of J.K. Rowling. After her divorce and struggling through personal hardships, she used her pain and frustration to fuel her creative work, eventually becoming one of the world's most successful authors. Or consider Oprah Winfrey, who, after years of personal and professional challenges, reinvented herself and went on to build a media empire. These stories, like George's, serve as a reminder that life after divorce isn't a sentence to failure. It can be a fresh start if we choose to embrace it. George's story isn't just about surviving betrayal. It's about thriving in the aftermath. He chose to take the lessons from his painful experiences and apply them to his life in a way that brought him fulfillment, satisfaction, and strength. As George sat on the deck of his restored beach house, watching the sunrise over the ocean, he found himself reflecting on the long, challenging journey he had endured. It wasn't just the legal battles or the financial maneuvers that had defined this period of his life. It was the emotional growth, the lessons learned, and the wisdom gained through adversity. Looking back, George realized that protecting his assets had been important, but protecting himself, emotionally and mentally, was just as crucial. The beach house, once a symbol of shared dreams with Vanessa, had now become a symbol of George's strength and resilience. He had learned how to safeguard not just his financial future, but also his heart. In doing so, he had found a way to move forward and rebuild a life of his own, one that was built on self-respect, inner strength, and the wisdom of knowing his own worth. The process of protecting his assets had been a form of self-preservation, but it had also helped him develop a deeper understanding of his emotional needs. George had gone from a man who was passive in his relationship to someone who understood that boundaries, whether in business or personal life, are essential. The lesson wasn't just about securing property. It was about securing his emotional well-being. Overcoming betrayal is never easy, and it's a journey that takes time, patience, and effort. For George, it was about recognizing that while he couldn't control Vanessa's actions, he could control how he responded. He chose not to be consumed by anger or bitterness. Instead, he focused on healing and rebuilding his life. In real life, overcoming betrayal often involves recognizing our own worth and reclaiming our power. It means letting go of the idea that the betrayal defines us and choosing to rise above it. George didn't allow Vanessa's actions to dictate his sense of self. He took control of the narrative, focused on his own growth, and create a future that was aligned with his values and goals. Psychologists often talk about the importance of emotional resilience in overcoming challenges like betrayal. It's not about denying the pain, but about choosing to move forward despite it. George's decision to rebuild his life, rather than dwell on the past, reflects this very principle. He didn't let his hurt or disappointment shape his future. He used it as fuel for personal growth and transformation. The power of emotional growth lies in the ability to adapt, to learn from our experiences, and to evolve into stronger versions of ourselves. George's story is a testament to the fact that, even after the deepest betrayals, it's possible to reclaim your peace, find your inner strength, and create a life that reflects who you are and what you stand for. Thank you so much for sticking with me until the end of this story. I hope George's journey has inspired you to look at life's challenges with a new perspective. Sometimes, it's not about reacting with anger or frustration, but about staying steady, protecting what matters most, and finding the strength to move forward, no matter how tough it gets. The real lesson here is that no matter what life throws at you, you have the power to regain control, set boundaries, and protect your peace. So, what did you take away from George's story? I'd love to hear your thoughts and reflections in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe for more amazing stories. I've got so many more incredible journeys to share with you, so stay tuned for the next one. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.